himself. Here he goes.
Okay, my name is Rick Lay. I've written books on Doc Savage and the Shadow, mainly chronologies, published by Altus Press. And I've written some books of fiction published by Wildcat Books and Black Coat Press. I'm going to be talking today about one of the most controversial and influential villains in fiction, Fu Manchu, who was created by,
We will have a door prize at the end of Rick's presentation. I'll be giving you tickets, and we'll pick a number. I think we'll be giving away one of Radio Archive's audiobooks. So stick around for that. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of Fu Manchu, who first appeared in book form in 1913. His creator was an Englishman whose real name was Arthur Sarsfield Ward, who wrote his books under the name of Sax Rohmer. Now, Fu Manchu is controversial because the character has its origins in racist myths that all Asians are bloodthirsty fanatics with little regard for human life. And the books reflected those unfortunate stereotypes. But as the series progressed, Fu Manchu became one of the most multifaceted villains in pulp history. He became a curious mixture of cruelty and chivalry. On the one hand, he could torture a man to death by feeding him to rats. On the other hand, he would never break his word to anybody, including an enemy. And as the series progressed, he began to have European accomplices helping him commit his crimes. And he would eventually find himself in a desperate war against both fascism and communism. Now, one thing about Fu Manchu, you always hear the term Fu Manchu mustache. In the books, he never had a mustache, but he's always depicted with a mustache on the cover of the books. The first book was published in England as The Mystery of Dr. Fu Manchu, and that's the title, which you can find it now on Amazon. It was also known as The Insidious Dr. Fu Manchu. That came out in 1913. In 1916, we had the sequel, The Return of Fu Manchu, and in 1917, we had the third book in the series, The Hand of Fu Manchu. Now, Fu Manchu goes through two phases as a character. The first series of novels were written around World War I, and the second series of novels begin from the 1930s and last until the end of the 50s. In the first phase, Fu Manchu is the agent of a secret society in China, which is eventually revealed to be called the C-Fan. He is not the head of the organization. He has been sent by the C-Fan to Europe as its main agent of sabotage. He is out to destroy the British Empire and all other Western nations. And he is mainly assassinating diplomats, kidnapping scientists, stealing plans for secret weapons, normal stuff that a pulp villain sort of does. In the third book, he apparently dies in a shipwreck off the coast of England with his daughter. But even though Fu Manchu died, there were echoes of him in other works by Sax Rohmer. The Yellow Claw, which was written concurrent with the Fu Manchu series, it was published in 1915, featured a French detective named Gaston Max, and the villain of that novel is a Chinese drug smuggler named Mr. King. Now, Mr. King has no overt connection to Fu Manchu and the Yellow Claw, but in 1919, Sax Rohmer had a book published called The Golden Scorpion, which featured a villain named Fo He, who you see depicted on the cover. He wore a mask, And Fo He is revealed to be an associate of both Fu Manchu and Mr. King. So we begin to get this vast conspiracy of Asian villains. The Si Fan appears in the novel, but it's called a Sublime Order. More connections to this sort of growing crime network began to pop up in Rohmer. In The Quest of the Sacred Slipper, he veered away from having Chinese villains to having Arab villains, and he created a revival of an actual organization, the Assassin Cult, which existed during the Crusades. The Assassins of the Middle East were sort of the forerunners of Al-Qaeda, in that they were ruled by a fanatical religious leader who promised his followers the keys to paradise if they committed murder in his name, and they also had them engage in suicidal attacks. Now, while there's no overt connection to the Fu Manchu novels in The Quest of the Sacred Slipper, when the series gets revised, that novel somewhat becomes pivotal, as you will shortly see. Now, the Si Fan in The Hand of Fu Manchu worshipped a mysterious woman called the Lady of the Si Fan, and it was sort of hinted that the Lady of Si Fan was some sort of incarnation of the Hindu goddess Kali, the goddess of destruction, that was worshipped by the Thuggee cult in India. If you've seen the Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, you know all about the cult of Thuggee. And there was a novelette written in the mid-20s called The Voice of Kali, which was long out of print, recently reprinted by Black Dog Books, in which there is an organization which is virtually identical to the Si Fan, and we can really say it's the Si Fan under another name. It's called the S Group, and it's using technology, super science based on sound, which was also present in the Golden Scorpion. Now then, throughout the 20s, Fu Manchu was supposed to be dead. And what then happens in 1929, Paramount Pictures gets the rights to Fu Manchu, and they produce a very popular movie called The Mysterious Dr. Fu Manchu, featuring a Swedish actor, Warner Olin, who looked Asian enough that he was always playing Chinese characters. You probably know Warner Olin, if for anything, for later playing Charlie Chan, a more benevolent character. It's sort of the antithesis to Dr. Fu Manchu. There was a sequel then made called The Return of Dr. Fu Manchu that was very successful. And in 1931, Sax Rohmer decided to revive the character by writing The Daughter of Fu Manchu, in which it's revealed that Fu Manchu and his daughter have survived, but Fu Manchu is now incredibly old. He was about in his 60s to begin with in the earlier series. It's now about 1930 or 1929 in the series. So he's very old and decrepit, and his daughter tries to revive the Si Fan, but Fu Manchu rises from retirement to stop her. He's sort of apparently at this point mellowed with his age and doesn't want to destroy the world anymore. An interesting little fact, Paramount didn't have the rights to this novel, but they decided to cash in on it anyway. So they made a third Fu Manchu movie with Warner Olin called Daughter of the Dragon, in which is the story of Fu Manchu's daughter, but she has a totally different name and characterization than in the book. So it was sort of an unofficial adaptation of Daughter of Fu Manchu. The next novel was The Mask of Fu Manchu, written in 1932, or published in 1932. It's important in that Fu Manchu now achieves the secret of immortality. He creates an elixir which makes him at least 20 years younger, and he has to take it at regular periods. But now we have an immortal mastermind. So the concept of immortality comes into the series in 1932. This is sort of phase 2 of Fu Manchu. And in the next novel in the series, The Bride of Fu Manchu in 1933, it is mentioned that Fu Manchu bears an extraordinary resemblance to an Egyptian mummy in the British Museum. And there were sort of vague suggestions that maybe Fu Manchu had achieved immortality earlier, and he's really some sort of immortal Egyptian rather than a Chinese Mandarin. Now, Rohmer had actually invented these concepts that he brought in to the Fu Manchu series in the 30s involving immortality in earlier books. And there's an important reason, as you'll later see, why I'm bringing this up. One book was written in 1924, that's 7 years before the phase 2 of Fu Manchu begins. And in that, the villain Greyface was an evil alchemist who had created an immortality elixir. In 1918, another book was published called Brood of the Witch Queen, in which the villain was a sorcerer named Anthony Ferrara, who was actually a revived Egyptian mummy. So we already see the concept of immortality and Egyptian mummy predating the Fu Manchu novel in which it appears. Now, Imitations of Fu Manchu began very early on, and a lot of these characters were named Wu Fang. There had been an actual person named Wu Fang, named Wu Fang, who was a Chinese diplomat in the United States in the early 1900s. And he was sort of the name that got borrowed to create these characters. The first writer to create a villain named Wu Fang was Arthur B. Reeve. He was writing for the Pulps, and they created a character named Craig Kennedy, who was a scientist, a criminologist who used gadgets to solve crime. Sort of very much a forerunner of Doc Savage, except that Craig Kennedy lacks a lot of the charisma of Doc Savage. Craig Kennedy became so popular that they began to make movie serials about him that Arthur B. Reeve helped co-write, and then he would write a novelization of. And there were 3 serials that were called the Elaine series. They starred a popular actress named Pearl White, who was always getting into trouble, and Craig Kennedy had to rescue her. And the 3 serials that began in 1914 and lasted till 1915 were The Exploits of Elaine, The New Exploits of Elaine, and The Romance of Elaine. Those 3 serials were novelized as 2 books, The Exploits of Elaine and The Romance of Elaine. Essentially, the second and third serial became the second book. Now, Wu Fang only pops up in the second installment, which is like the first part of The Romance of Elaine, in the novelization. We don't have the original serial. But according to the IMDb, International Movie Database, Wu Fang was in the first serial, Exploits of Elaine. And he was played by an actor who I know very little about named Edward Alden. And if you go into the IMDb website and look at the cast list of the third serial, you'll see Warner Oland in the cast, but it doesn't say who he played. So I don't know if he had any connection to Wu Fang at all when he appeared in that serial. However, in a later serial, also starring Pearl White, called The Lightning Raider, Warner Oland did end up playing a villain named Wu Fang. Now, we don't know too much about this serial because it's lost. The main female character, the Lightning Raider, is a sort of Catwoman-like character, a female thief who's somewhat sympathetic, and she ends up stealing something that an evil Chinese mastermind wants, and that seems to be the main plot. Now, Warner Oland is one of 2 actors who both played Fu Manchu and an incarnation of Wu Fang. The other is Boris Karloff, as we shall shortly see. In Pulp Fiction, Harold Lamb wrote a novel, I believe it was originally for Adventure, called Martian Sands, which was published in book form in 1919. And the plot involves a lost city in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, which an evil Mandarin named Wu Fang does not want an American expedition to find. A totally different Wu Fang was actually created by Sax Rohmer in 1925 in a novel called Yellow Shadows, which is about a secret society that worshipped the golden lotus. This Wu Fang is a minor character, a henchman of another villain, and really forgettable, but maybe Sax Rohmer was parodying all these imitation Fu Manchus when he wrote it. But two major Wu Fangs appeared in the 1930s in their own series. The first was created in the United Kingdom and was written by a writer named Roland Daniel for a pulp magazine called The Thriller. Roland Daniel was writing crime novels in imitation of the more popular Edgar Wallace. And I've never seen a good list of how many Wu Fang novels he wrote. But it's more than the 4 that you usually see mentioned, and you only see 4 mentioned because the titles have Wu Fang in them. They're Wu Fang, Wu Fang's Revenge, Son of Wu Fang, and The Return of Wu Fang. One thing about Roland Daniels, Wu Fang is, in these novels is essentially a master criminal out to rule the world like Fu Manchu. Roland Daniels didn't understand Chinese names like some of the other writers in these series. And he thought that the family name came second, like was European names. But actually in China, the family name comes first. So the family name is Wu, and the personal name here is Fang. But he thought it was the other way around, so when he wrote a book called The Son of Wu Fang, the family name becomes Fang. All the other writers, as far as I know, who made Wu Fang type characters, all use Wu as the family name. The most important Wu Fang to appear was Robert J. Hogan's The Mysterious Wu Fang, who appeared in 7 issues from 1935 to 1936. This Wu Fang is connected to a secret society which worships a black lotus, and maybe that idea came from Yellow Shadows by Sax Rohmer, in which a minor league Wu Fang was connected to a secret society that worshipped a golden lotus. There were other criminals who used the Wu surname but didn't have the personal name of Fang. One such character was a villainess named Wu Tu, who appeared in a 1936 novel called Full Moon by Talbot Mundy, which I believe originally appeared in Adventure. Wu Tu means 5 poisons in English. Wu can be translated as 5. Wu Tu was interested in trying to find a secret gateway to another dimension in Mundy's novel. In the pages of The Spider, there was a villain named Wu Chang, also known as the Red Mandarin. And this was a very insidious villain who wanted to kill everybody in New York by poisoning cigarettes during the Christmas season. And he had an evil daughter named Wu Yashi, which means 5 wild chickens. And she captures the Spider's girlfriend, Nita Van Sloan, and wants to have her seduced by an orangutan. In one of the most wild endings to a Spider novel you will ever read. Now, outside the pulps, there were other versions of a Wu Fang character. Boris Karloff, in a movie called West of Shanghai, made in 1937, was a Chinese warlord named Wu Yen Fang. And there was a popular series of novels about a character named Mr. Moto by John P. Marquand. Now, in the books, Moto is a Japanese spy and a somewhat morally ambiguous character. If you're familiar with the name Mr. Moto, you saw the movies with Peter Lorre, in which Mr. Moto suddenly becomes a detective, sort of a Japanese Charlie Chan. In Mr. Moto Is So Sorry, there is a minor villain named Wu Fang, who's a warlord allied with the Japanese in northern China. But the best uses of Wu Fang occurred in the James Clavell Asian saga, starting with Taipan in 1966. And in that series, we meet a family called Fraudulent, which is a family of merchants who come into conflict with various parties, including a group of pirates ruled by a man named Wu Fang, and his descendants would cause problems for the Struan family in the decades that follow. This becomes a sort of Wu Fang crime family. And in Noble House from 1981, there is the leader of the family in the 1960s is named Four-Fingered Wu. He has a son whose real name is Wu Fang, even though he uses the alias of Paul Choi in the novel. And there is a brief reference that Four-Fingered Wu's father and predecessor as leader of the crime family died in 1937. Now, I don't know if that was sort of a veiled reference to Robert J. Hogan's Wu Fang, but you never know. Now, Wu Fang was also called the Dragon Lord of Crime in Robert J. Hogan's novels. And there had been earlier Dragon Lords of Crime that had influenced that title. In August, starting in 1918, there was a series called Peter the Brazen about an American radio operator who fights Asian master criminals. The series was written by George F. Warts under the pseudonym of Lauren Brent when it was published in Argosy. And the archenemy of Peter the Brazen in the first series of stories was the Gray Dragon, who lives in a lost city in Tibet, kidnaps women all over the world to become part of his harem, and when he's through with them, he forces them to he enslaves them by throwing them into a mercury mine. Now, the concept of dragon was, or Dragon Lord, was never really used by Sax Rohmer in the Fu Manchu novels, but it entered the movies. When they made the Warner Oland films, Fu Manchu's symbol became the dragon. He was even called the dragon, especially in the third movie, Daughter of the Dragon. And he would use the dragon as a symbol that he sent in death threats to his enemies. Other dragon lords of crime popped up in the Spider. The most sinister of these characters was the Dragon Lord of the Underworld, who was most notorious for killing a major character in the Spider. The Spider had a mentor named Professor Brownlee, who devised the ring by which the Spider branded criminals. Well, this villain killed him before getting dispatched by the Spider, killed Professor Brownlee. In another very wild plot called Slaves of the Dragon, a totally different dragon decides to kidnap thousands of American women from New York State, ship them over to Manchuria, which was then controlled by the Japanese. And the Japanese were then going to mate the women with Mongolian warriors to create a super race of soldiers. This incredibly racist plot was somewhat balanced by having a Chinese secret agent from the government of China helping the Spider foil the master criminal. In addition to dragon villains, we also had Chinese villains who got associated with Cobra as the major symbol. In Detective Fiction Weekly, starting in 1931, there was a series about a man named Jimmy Wentworth, who was a policeman in San Francisco. Ironically, he has the same surname as Richard Wentworth, the Spider. And all of these stories have been collected as the Tongue of Terror. They were written by Sidney Herschel Small, and the omnibus collection is published by Battered Silicon Dispatch Box. And in these stories, Jimmy Wentworth has to prevent a villain named Kong Gay, alias the Cobra, from taking over San Francisco's underworld. Now, when Wu Fang got canceled, Popular Publications, which was publishing that series, decided to revive a similar Fu Manchu character as Dr. Yen Sin. And he was also known as the Cobra, and he led an international espionage organization called the Invisible Empire. Sax Rohmer had also been popular for writing about the drug trade, as we saw earlier, was The Yellow Claw. In 1919, Rohmer wrote a novel called Dope, in which the villain is an evil drug trader named Mr. Sin, has a pet raven, as you can see on the cover here. And that novel became so notorious, in a way, that it caused Scotland Yard to launch a massive campaign against drug trafficking in London. Another book written by Sax Rohmer was You and He See Last, which he wrote in 1932, 1 year after Fu Manchu was revived. And this was an attempt to create another Asian villain who would rival Fu Manchu. And You and He See is a drug smuggler who sometimes uses the alias of Mr. King, which was the name of the villain in The Yellow Claw. And it was never quite clear whether You and He See was really the Mr. King of The Yellow Claw. The Mr. King of the earlier novel is supposedly drowned in the Thames River in London, but his body was never found. But You and He See, even though he escapes completely unscratched at the end of the novel, never returned because the book just didn't sell. Now, the idea of opium crime lords popped up in the pulps. Walter Gibson used it for the shadow in a novel called Green Eyes. Now, one thing about Walter Gibson, he was well aware of the racial aspects of the Fu Manchu type of villain, and he tried to compensate for them. In many of his novels, when there's an Asian villain, the Asian villain turns out to be really a Caucasian in disguise, who has been tricking all these poor Chinese deluded henchmen to work for him. Or the other trick that Gibson used was, if he really had to have a legitimate Asian villain, he would create a good Asian character to be a major ally of the Shadow against the villain. There was a recurring character in the Shadow pulps called Dr. Roy Tan, who was always helping the Shadow against Chinese master criminals. In Argosy, the Peter the Brazen series got revived in the 1930s, and in a novelette called That Cargo of Opium, Peter the Brazen had to try to stop drug smuggling on the China Seas. The Golden Scorpion would influence many other villains in the pulps. Now, this was a masked villain whose name was Fo He, and he had yellow eyes. We never learned why he wore the mask. But the concept of a masked villain with yellow eyes probably came from Gaston Leroux's Phantom of the Opera. Here we see being played by Lon Chaney in the silent film. And in Gaston Leroux's novel, the Phantom wore a mask because he had a skull-like face. Now, while Sax Rohmer never said Fo He had a skull-like face, the connection between the two was rather obvious, and it was noted by Robert E. Howard when he wrote a novel called Skullface in 1929. So in this novel, he creates a Fu Manchu-type villain called the Scorpion, who has a skull-like face and yellow eyes, sort of a combination of Fo He and the Phantom of the Opera. He also makes this villain, Skullface, who's also named Cthulhu, a revived mummy from Atlantis, a resurrected mummy from Atlantis. Now, this novel was written in 1929, or published in 1929 in Weird Tales. This is before the face of Fu Manchu. So Fu Manchu is yet to become an immortal, and there's no reference to him resembling a mummy at the time this novel was written. Now, could Robert E. Howard have influenced Sax Rohmer? Probably not. Probably Howard rather brilliantly deduced the direction that the Fu Manchu series should take and borrowed the ideas from those earlier two novels I mentioned, Gray Face, which was about an immortality serum, and Brood of the Witch Queen, about a villain who's a revived mummy, and just grafted them onto the Fu Manchu character. There was another Scorpion villain in the Peter the Brazen series who became probably the best conceived imitation of a Fu Manchu type villain, the Blue Scorpion. And the Blue Scorpion appeared in 3 novels, Cave of the Blue Scorpion, Sting of the Blue Scorpion, and The Sapphire Depth. And in this trilogy, the Blue Scorpion is not seen for the first 2 novels, but in the 3rd novel, when he appears, he's wearing a mask, and his eyes are described as being like sparks, which implies that they're yellow. And we do eventually find out what's beneath the mask. It's not a skull-like face, but it's something even uglier. You'll have to read the novel to find out what it is. Now, Sax Rohmer wasn't the only writer who utilized Asian sorcery. There were writers who predated Sax Rohmer. And one such writer was an American named Robert W. Chambers. And in 1896, he wrote a novel called The Maker of Moons, in which there is a secret society of Chinese sorcerers from a lost city called Yian, and they come to the United States and battle American Secret Service agents. Now, we wrote a totally different novel that's often overlooked in 1917 called The Dark Star. If you know anything about Chambers, you know that he had pioneered the concept of cosmic horror, that there were entities out in outer space who were somewhat worshipped as gods and threatened us, sort of predating the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And his most famous character was the King in Yellow from the 1890s. Well, Chambers had abandoned the King in Yellow a long time ago, but he revived a lot of the concepts in the Dark Star, where there is a dark star in outer space in which the being who is the equivalent of Satan lives and is influencing events on the planet Earth that eventually caused World War I. And this being, who is the equivalent of Satan, is called Erlich, which is the equivalent of the devil in Mongolian mythology. And Chambers begins to create a totally fictional concept of a Erlich cult in Asia. There really is no cult worshipping Erlich in Asia. The Mongolians just fear him as the devil. They worship more benign beings. But in The Slayer of Souls, written 2 years later in 1919, Chambers takes the sorcerers from Yian and makes them worshippers of Erlich. And again has a story where they're in the United States battling Secret Service agents. The Slayer of Souls, if you ever read it, reads like a Supernatural Operator 5 novel. It was all sorts of massive destruction in the United States. Robert E. Howard liked this concept of an Erlich cult, and he borrowed it from Robert W. Chambers. But he noticed that Chambers had made several errors in his writings. First of all, Robert W. Chambers didn't have any clear idea where Mongolia was located. He thought it was right near Iran and Iraq, rather than Siberia and Manchuria. And he also had this Erlich cult spawning other cults that existed among Arabs and Persians, such as the assassin cult that I mentioned earlier from the Quest of the Sacred Slipper, that actually existed during the Crusades. And there is a cult in Kurdistan, which is in Iraq and Iran, called the Yazidi religion, which believes that God has given the world to Satan to rule. So he was making the Yazidis and the assassins sort of synonymous with the Erlich cult, which they really aren't. So what Robert E. Howard does, first in the story called The Daughter of Erlich Khan, which is about the god Erlich, he has a branch of the Erlich cult in Afghanistan, which makes sense. He still has them in Mongolia, but he has them in both Mongolia and Afghanistan. So now we have a natural bridge for the Erlich cult to infiltrate the Middle East. And the female character who is worshipped as the daughter of the evil god, has a black star birthmark, and that whole concept of the black star comes directly from Robert W. Chambers' novel, The Dark Star. And the other story. This was in a series about a character named Francis X. Gordon, also known as El Barak the Swift, an American who has adventures in Afghanistan. And besides the daughter of Ehrlich Khan, another adventure of Francis X. Gordon was Three-Bladed Doom, in which there is a sort of C-fan type organization called the Hidden Ones, which is an alliance of the Ehrlich cult, was the Yazidi cult, was the Assassin cult. So Robert E. Howard made a more believable version of all of Robert W. Chambers' concepts. Now, the Ehrlich cult also appeared in Robert E. Howard's spicy fiction, such as The Purple Heart of Ehrlich, which you can find in Spicy Adventures, published by Robert E. Howard Foundation. In The Purple Heart of Ehrlich, there is a worshipper of Ehrlich living in Shanghai who has a jewel sacred to the god and kills people and then soaks the jewel in their blood. Another iteration of Ehrlich, the Ehrlich cult, was in a story called Black God of Vengeance, which you can find in several Robert E. Howard collections like Trails in Darkness. In this story, an American explorer falls into the hands of the priests of Ehrlich in Mongolia and has plastic surgery performed on his face, which makes him look like a dog man, that is then sent back to the United States to kill people. Now, Robert E. Howard had reworked the concepts of Robert W. Chambers and intermixed them with Sax Rohmer. And he literally combines the worlds in a fragment called The White Jade Ring, which you can find in the early adventures of El Barak, published by the Robert E. Howard Foundation. In that story, it's mentioned that Francis X. Gordon has encountered two great secret societies in the Far East. One of the priests of Ehrlich, from Robert W. Chambers, and the other is the C-Fan from Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu novels. In 1932, we saw the best and the worst movie adaptation of Fu Manchu ever made, called The Mask of Fu Manchu with Boris Karloff. It's the best in terms of cast. It stars Myrna Loy as his daughter. It's got good production values. It's got good special effects. It can really be great fun to watch, except it's blatantly racist. Boris Karloff says stuff like, "Kill the white man and take his women." It's got a horrible ending that I'm not even going to describe. So if you ever see this movie, you're going to have very mixed feelings about it. Now, in this movie, they changed the plot of the book. In the plot of the book, Fu Manchu is trying to find the tomb of an Islamic heretic named El Mokena, who actually existed in the 8th century. And El Mokena was sort of a real-life Phantom of the Opera. He was a disfigured man who wore a mask. In the movie version, the Hollywood producers looked at it and said, "Nobody's heard of this guy, El Mokena. Let's use somebody, let's have Fu Manchu look for the tomb of somebody who's at least well-known to everyone." So they opted for Genghis Khan. So they said, for some reason, Genghis Khan had a mask, sort of like a death mask, put over his corpse. And if Fu Manchu wore that, he would then become the heir of Genghis Khan, and everybody in Asia would worship him as the great savior or something. So the concept of Genghis Khan got tied to the Fu Manchu legend, and that was reflected in the pulps. Robert E. Howard had created a detective named Steve Harrison, who was a policeman battling Asian criminals in an unknown American city, unnamed American city, probably on the West Coast. And Steve Harrison's archenemy was Ehrlich Khan, who takes his name from the Mongolian god. But this Ehrlich Khan was also a descendant of Genghis Khan. There was a writer in the United Kingdom named Mark Channing, whose writings appeared in the British pulps. And Mark Channing wrote novels about a character named Colin Gray, who was sort of a more muscular version of Talbot Mundy's Secret Service agents in India. And one of the villains that Colin Gray came across was a man named Suleiman Khun, who was a descendant of Genghis Khan. And Suleiman Khun first appeared in a novel called The King Cobra. King Cobra is an ally of Suleiman Khun. King Cobra is not Chinese. He's an Afghan or an Indian. I'm not sure what. He's a bandit along the Afghan-Indian border. And then Suleiman Khun returned in a novel called 9 Lives. Now, the novel King Cobra and the second novel in the series, White Python, will be published by Altus Press probably sometime later in the year. And then later we'll get the third and the fourth. There were 4 novels in all. The third and the fourth novel being 9 Lives, will then probably be reprinted by Altus. But many of the concepts from Mark Channing surprisingly pop up in the shadow novels involving Shi Wen Khan that Walter Gibson wrote using the pseudonym of Maxwell Grant. For example, we have a descendant of Genghis Khan who has the same initials, SK, as Suleiman Khun. This is Shi Wen Khan. And all of the mystical tricks that Shi Wen Khan performs, which are almost identical to the powers of which go beyond the powers of the shadow on radio. Shi Wen Khan can literally cloud men's minds, so you can't see him. Have a parallel, at least, in the Mark Channing novels. That doesn't necessarily mean that Mark Channing influenced Walter Gibson. They may have just been reading similar books about Tibet and mystical feats. But you'll find the 2 series very similar. That may just be a coincidence. Now, Walter Gibson, besides using the Genghis Khan idea from the movie version of Mask of Fu Manchu, also used the real plot, a variation of the real plot from the novel The Mask of Fu Manchu, by having a villain called the Veiled Prophet, who claims to be a reincarnation of the Islamic heretic Al-Makena. Now, the concept of a Genghis Khan type villain was so popular that it had another variation. At the end of World War I, a former officer in the Tsarist army named Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, he was part Baltic German, part Hungarian, went to Mongolia to try to conquer that country and literally declared himself the modern reincarnation of Genghis Khan. He ruled Mongolia despotically for about a year before Lenin said to the Soviet army they had to knock him off. Now, that whole real-life events involving Baron von Ungern-Sternberg have a strange parallel in the works of Doc Savage by Lester Dent, writing as Kenneth Robeson. If you look at the character of John Sunlight, the most famous villain, the Battle Doc Savage. John Sunlight, in the first novel, Fortress of Solitude, is a former soldier in the Russian army. It's the Soviet army as opposed to the Tsarist army, but that parallel exists. And in the second novel, John Sunlight goes to Asia. This is the Devil Genghis is the novel. John Sunlight goes to Asia and tries to set up an empire there as a modern incarnation of Genghis Khan. Now, we now come to the wonderful world of the Aviation pulps. And it was a simple rule in the Aviation pulps. Once a sinister sort of villain becomes popular in the pulps, put him in an airplane to fight for the Kaiser in World War I. And that applies to vampires, werewolves, zombies, and even descendants of Genghis Khan. And there was one of the writers for Daredevil Aces was O.B. Myers. There was a collection put out by Age of Aces called The Black Sheep of Belak, or Belog, I guess is how you pronounce it. And inside that book is the collection of a series of stories involving a character called the Mongol Ace, whose real name is Genghis Khan. He's a descendant of Genghis Khan, who the Germans trained to fly an airplane and fight the Allies. And if we're going to put a descendant of Genghis Khan in an aircraft, why not a Fu Manchu-like mastermind, which brings us to Chu Lung from G8 and his Battle Aces, who first appeared in, I think, the October 1936 issue. Hogan had originally, Robert J. Hogan, who was writing G8, had originally written Wu Fang, and the series had been canceled about 7 months before. So he probably had some plots lying around in his head about Asian criminals, so he incorporated them into the G8 series. Another work that influenced the presentation of Chinese villain in the pulps was a non-fiction work written by an American journalist named Aliko E. Lilius called I Sailed with Chinese Pirates. It was published in 1930. And it told the story of actual Chinese pirates in Asia. Now, this concept of Chinese pirates then became popular in the pulps that was merged with the Fu Manchu type of villain. And one example was in Doc Savage. There was a novel called Pirate of the Pacific in which a Chinese pirate named Tom Tu tries to take over a fictionalized version of the Philippines. But the most popular character mentioned in I Sailed with Chinese Pirates was a real-life woman who was called the Dragon Lady. You see what she really looks like over on the right. That was published. That was a picture from the book I Sailed with Chinese Pirates. But of course, she became fictionalized more glamorously in Terry and the Pirates, started in 1934. And they used her real name for the fictionalized character. The Dragon Lady's real name is Lai Choi San. Lai is her family name. It is spelled L-A-I, the same as my name. For all I know, she's a distant relative.
Yes.
Now, Warren Hastings Millers did a series set in China about a captain named Jim Colvin, who skippers a trading vessel. And one of these stories is called The Peach of Pirates. It's available from Black Dog Books in the collection Raiders of the Seas. And that actually has Lai Choi San, the Dragon Lady, as a character, as in fact the main villain of the piece. A more flamboyant and fictional Chinese pirate was Lotus Burma, who became a recurring adversary of Peter the Brazen. She was called the Octopus of Hong Kong because she had a pet octopus for which she would feed people to. That concept got imported into Doc Savage, where Lotus Burma was sort of influenced a later character named Lo La, who tried to feed Doc Savage to an octopus in a novel called The Feathered Octopus. Walter Gibson went a more traditional route with Chinese pirates in the shadow. He had a novel called The Chinese Primrose, in which a pirate from Taiwan is trying to steal a valuable necklace. Now, besides the idea of Asian villains, there was a concept of Eurasian villains, villains of mixed race. They tend to be even more brutal than the Asian villains. Now, I'm 1/4 Chinese, and if I was a character in a pulp novel, I'd be a Eurasian pirate out to rule the world. The first writer who really started to pioneer Eurasian villains was a writer named Ahmed Abdullah, who is not Arab, is really British and Russian descent, but was very popular in the early pulps. And for either Augusty or All Story, he wrote a series called The God of the Invincibly Strong Arms, in which there was a sea fan-like organization which worships sort of a male version of the Hindu goddess Kali. The two novels in that series are The Red Stain and The Blue-Eyed Manchu, which are available from Amazon in books which have ridiculous covers, as you can see. But stories that had better covers came out, and there are two great pulp novels involving Eurasian villains that I recommend. One is by A. Marin, it's called 7 Footprints to Satan, in which there is a villain named Satan who is involved, head of an organization which seeks lost relics around the world. It's sort of an Indiana Jones type adventure before Indiana Jones was created. And in the pages of adventure, the American secret agent Jim Grimm had his final adventure in a novel that was originally called King of the World, but it's also called Jim Grimm. And in that novel, Jim Grimm meets his ultimate adversary, a villain named Dorj, who was a Eurasian who's discovered the secrets of Atlantis in the Gobi Desert. And the novel climaxes with both Jim Grimm and Dorj apparently dying in an explosion. Seabury Quinn wrote a short story called The Isles of the Missing Ships for Weird Tales involving his occult detective Jules de Grandin. Now, a lot of de Grandin's adventures are horror without supernatural elements, and The Isle of Missing Ships is one such example. And it has a very strong resemblance to Ian Fleming's later 1958 novel, Dr. No. Here are the similarities. The villain of the Jules de Grandin story is Gunag Bisar, who is a son of a British missionary and a Malaysian woman of good family. In the James Bond story, Dr. No is the son of a German missionary and a Chinese woman of good family. Both villains have underground dining rooms below sea level where there are magnifying glasses which make fish look enormous. Those scenes are virtually identical. In the short story from Weird Tales, the Malaysian villain has a pet octopus. Now, in the book version of Dr. No, the villain has a pet squid. It's not in the movie version. So whether Jules de Grandin influenced James Bond, I'll let you decide, but the similarities exist. But there was a character who actually influenced Seabury Quinn, an earlier Chinese villain, in another Jules de Grandin story. There was a writer named H. Ashton Wolf who occasionally wrote for Detective Fiction Weekly, but he mainly wrote for American Weekly, which was a magazine later edited by A. Merritt. And H. Ashton Wolf was an Englishman who had served with the French police, the Sûreté, right before World War I. And he had been involved in some criminal cases and worked with some notable forensic scientists. And he decided to write stories about all these cases he supposedly helped solve, many of which only existed in his imagination. Facts were totally made up. He was an author of fraudulent nonfiction. And he created a Chinese master criminal named Hanoi Shan in at least 7 stories that I know of, who became fairly popular in this fraudulent nonfiction. Now, a myth has developed that Hanoi Shan was the real-life inspiration for Fu Manchu. Hanoi Shan never existed, and the stories about him appeared long after the Fu Manchu story started. But Seabury Quinn liked this villain and created a character named Dr. Sun Ah Poi in a story called The Lost Lady. And Dr. Sun Ah Poi is the only recurring villain to fight Jules de Grandin in Weird Tales. He also appears in a story called Satan's Stepson. Now, both Hanoi Shan and Sun Ah Poi have identical origins. They are originally kindly rulers of an Indo-Chinese province who are attacked by an elephant that slams them into a tree and causes them to become a crippled hunchback and therefore embittered against humanity. Now, eventually somebody started to look at this whole outbreak of anti-Chinese fiction in the pulps and realized how ridiculous it was, because China in the 1930s wasn't threatening anybody. It was being threatened by Japan. Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931. It then slowly began to gobble up parts of China. In 1937, it then engaged in an outright invasion of the country and committed horrible atrocities. So, at least one writer, and this is W. Wirt, who was writing a story about an American adventurer in the Far East named Jimmy Cordy, said, let's make the Japanese villains. Let's leave the Chinese alone. So, Jimmy Cordy, who had been formerly fighting Chinese warlords, ended up fighting Japanese generals in the service of Chinese warlords in the pages of Aviation. But then we began to get novels about Japanese plots to attack the United States. Now, these originally were disguised. There was a Doc Savage novel called The Red Snow, in which agents of an unnamed foreign country, that is clearly Japan, have a red dust that if it touches your skin disintegrates you. And in the pages of Black Mass, there was a novel by Carol John Daly about the most popular detective in that magazine at the time, Race Williams, called Murder from the East. And in that novel, there is a campaign of sabotage by an Asian nation called Astran, A-S-T-R-A-N, that is clearly Japan under another name. But one writer decided to take on Japan openly, and that was a man named Felix Faust, who also wrote as Max Brand and Frederick Frost. And he created a character named Anthony Hamilton, who was supposedly the top agent in the American Secret Service. Now, the American Secret Service in the 1930s protected the president and chased counterfeiters. But if you believe these novels, the American Secret Service was more like the CIA in the 1930s. So Frederick Frost has Anthony Hamilton fighting Japanese agents around the world. There were 3 novels about Anthony Hamilton: Secret Agent Number 1, Spy Meets Spies, and The Bamboo Whistle. Walter Gibson came up with an interesting take on this whole concept of whether we should have a Chinese or a Japanese criminal. In a novel called The Devil Master, Walter Gibson created competing Asian masterminds, one Chinese, one Japanese, and they fight each other to become ruler of the world. Now, as I said before, anything that walks on 2 legs and is sinister in the pulps ended up flying a German airplane in popular publications. So, since Japanese villains were becoming popular, they decided to have a Japanese villain named Herr Matsu in G8 in his battle aces. Now, historically, Japan was fighting Germany during World War I, but that didn't stop Hogan from using a Japanese villain. Matsu first appeared in Wings of the White Death, and then he later reappeared in a novel called Red Fangs of the Sky Emperor, in which he's teamed up with Dr. Chu Lung, which shows that the Kaiser can resolve all differences between Japanese and Chinese masterminds. Now, eventually, we began to get novels about America being invaded by an Asian country outright. And popular publications published these novels. In 1934, there was Dusty Airs and his Battle Birds, in which there was a mysterious Asian ruler named Red Eyes who takes over all of Asia and all of Europe and then attacks the United States in a supposedly slightly distant future. And in Operator 5, there had been novels where Chinese master criminals ran rampant in the United States, releasing plagues and death rays and all sorts of horrors. But when Japan really started to become a troublemaker in the world, in 1939 they began a series called The Yellow Vulture, in which a Japanese warlord actually invades the United States. Now, this series never finished because near the end of 1939, World War II broke out in Europe, and the publishers wisely predicted that, maybe some nation might attack the United States now that we have war in Europe, might even be Japan. So the magazine got canceled in late 1939. Now, Fu Manchu continued into the 1940s. The series sort of peaks was the island of Fu Manchu in 1941. In this novel, Fu Manchu has accumulated a vast arsenal over the years. He's assembled it in Haiti. He has submarines and airplanes armed with disintegration rays. And he's going to intervene in World War II. We don't know on whose side yet. But the whole arsenal blows up, and that is sort of the turning point in the Fu Manchu series. He'll be in other novels, but he'll never be as great a world threat as he had become. In 1940, there was a serial called Drums of Fu Manchu with Henry Brandon, made by Republic Pictures, which revived the Genghis Khan plot in which Fu Manchu was searching for the tomb of the Mongol conqueror. That was sort of like the last gasps of Fu Manchu in the 40s. In the 50s, in 1956, there was a TV series called The Adventures of Fu Manchu. It starred an actor named Glenn Gordon, who wasn't right for the role. The only good thing about that series is that the actress, I think her name is Lorenz, is pretty good looking. Other than that, there's nothing really to recommend it. And Fu Manchu continued in novels, the last one being Emperor Fu Manchu, which I believe was written in 59, or published in 59. The problem with the Fu Manchu series at this point is that he has become eclipsed by world events. He's not the most dangerous man in the world anymore. Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong are more dangerous. So the series lost something in the 50s. But in the 1960s, there was a movie series created by Dr. Fu Manchu with Christopher Lee. The first movie in that series is The Face of Fu Manchu, made in 1965. And it's a pretty decent adventure movie. And it would be sequels which gradually deteriorated in quality up until like the early 70s. However, Fu Manchu got revived in the comics by Marvel in a comic book called Master of Kung Fu, which got around the racial aspects of the character by having the hero be the son of Fu Manchu and making this character a martial arts hero in the tradition of Bruce Lee. Finally, we saw revivals of this novel by different writers. Kay Van Ash wrote 10 Years Beyond Baker Street. Kay Van Ash had been the secretary for Sax Rohmer. In this novel, Fu Manchu battled Sherlock Holmes on the eve of World War I. And it would be a later novel by Kay Van Ash called The Fires of Fu Manchu, set during World War I. In 2009, my friend William Patrick Maynard began to write a series of excellent novels about Fu Manchu. So far, there's been The Terror of Fu Manchu, The Destiny of Fu Manchu, and upcoming is The Triumph of Fu Manchu, which supposedly will bring back the villain from The Golden Scorpion. But in New Pulp, we see other iterations of Asian villains. In Captain Hazard, Citadel of Fear, which is a revival of a one-shot Doc Savage type hero, Ron Fortier and Martin Powell created an Asian villainess who apparently is meant to be the daughter of Dr. Yen Sin. And as a personal plug, next week we'll see the publication of a collection of short stories by me called Shadows of the Opera, Retribution of Blood, in which one of the villains fought by the heroine, who is a vigilante trained by the Phantom of the Opera, is a character named Fu He, who has golden eyes, a skull-like face, and a mentor who curiously resembles Dr. Fu Manchu. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Everyone got a ticket?